It's time to go deeper. To go deeper into Sergei Eisenstein's ingenuity, into Ivan the Terrible, into the Soviet regime. Let's go. Oh, Sergei! Why aren't you still alive? Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to fanboy there. But I mean, come on. This guy was phenomenal. He was a filmmaker, theater director, film theorist, artist, an influencer, and more importantly, a political activist. Well, did he really have a choice there? Did he? For him, film was a means to educate, to ecstasize, and to elevate. In his last major work, Ivan the Terrible, released in 1945, Eisenstein proves film's potential to act as a political catalyst. He implicitly criticizes the Soviet regime, but he also foregrounds it as well. You might ask, how could this be? It is precisely through the practice of praising it and affirming it in which criticism arises. To approach such a discussion, we must first dive into the theoretical background of Slavoj Žižek's term, subversive affirmation, which would help us understand how the film encompasses critique within the confines of its forms and structures. The term is as ambiguous as it sounds. Žižek coins the term in the backdrop of Slovenian band Laibach's performances. He claims that Laibach were either interpreted as Nazis or Soviets, or an ironic imitation of them. However, Žižek goes further and argues that they are neither, not Nazis nor an ironic imitation of them. They are subversive in their nature just because they reenact and affirm what Nazism stands for, and by doing so, they destabilize meaning. Laibach affirmed the ideology and bring it to light, and concurrently, it sparks discourse around the ideology itself, which turns it in and against itself. This is at the heart of criticism. Žižek claims with regards to Laibach, Laibach, frustrates the system, the ruling ideology, precisely insofar as it is not its ironic imitation, it represents an over-identification with it. By bringing to light the obscene superego underside of the system, over-identification suspends its efficiency. It primarily destabilizes the system as it uncovers what it needs to repress in order to function. It goes the same way with Eisenstein's film. When it was first premiered at the Goskino, the Soviet Film Committee, Eisenstein's contemporaries were appalled by the similarities between Ivan and Stalin. To understand how Eisenstein makes such a connection with this film, we need to formally analyze the techniques he uses. In order to do so, we need to use the concept of excess as coined by Kristen Thompson. Thompson understands excess as a single motivation may serve to justify a device that is then repeated and varied many times. By this repetition, the device may far outweigh its original motivation and take on an importance greater than its narrative or compositional function would seem to warrant. I will argue that Ivan the Terrible's excess is precisely what fuels its subversive nature. It moves on from its narrative function and functions as other, as subversive affirmation, and functions on a contextual level. It portrays traits of Ivan, and concurrently, steps outside the film and connotes the regime. In other words, and vis-a-vis Thompson, excess is a device that does not really further narrative progression, but it does have a function within the narrative. In the case of Eisenstein, the technique is used to portray Ivan's character repetitively and through different cinematic channels. Through this excessive focus on Ivan's character representation, the film creates a surplus which affirms the dominant ideology. By implicitly portraying the dominant ideology on the screen, the film provokes the regime and questions its mechanisms. He showcases what is repressed within that regime, what cannot be talked about. Okay, let's go into the abyss. The first form of excess is literally background in the beginning of the film, during the coronation sequence. Right before Ivan comes into the Russian Orthodox Church, the varying ambassadors from Europe and from the territories within Russia voice their opinion about the upcoming crowned Tsar. Eisenstein thus paves the way to the Tsar's entrance through the ambassadors' positions. During some of the sequences, Eisenstein backgrounds and bombards the scene with Russian Orthodox iconography, frescoes. Eisenstein himself attached great importance to how the background of scenes parallels with one's persona. As he has stated, painted background as an emotional commentary to the dramatic person A. This principle must become key as to the staging. One significant fresco that stands out is during a medium wide-angle shot and a medium close-up shot of the foreign ambassadors. The fresco depicts Lazarus, wrapped around in a shroud, being resurrected by Jesus Christ. The fresco is predicated off of the biblical story of how Jesus resurrects Lazarus from the dead, primarily due to Lazarus' faith in Jesus. As the biblical story goes, Jesus asserts, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die." The analogy and collocation are clear. Ivan, much like Jesus, is going to bring the Russian state back to life, to resurrect it and bring it back from the dead. Anyone who stands in his way or doesn't succumb to him will be trumped by Ivan. The fresco thus tacitly and visually foreshadows Ivan's persona by creating such a collocation. The fresco connotes Ivan's character traits and concurrently the mechanisms of the Stalinist regime and all totalitarian regimes in general by showcasing two parables that ostracize anyone who does not believe in the central dogma. By doing so, Ivan's character traits are propelled through other cinematic channels. Ivan's persona is not only extended through the fresco, but also through the centrality he occupies around the space. Eisenstein sets up the composition of the scene by centralizing Ivan, where the setting is set up in such a way that it revolves around his body. The setting thus becomes a physical outer expression of his superiority and centrality. During the same coronation sequence, when the archdeacon introduces Ivan's arrival, there's a long shot of the cathedral. Later on, when Ivan starts giving his speech, the same shot reappears, this time with Ivan in the middle of the shot, in the midst of the people. Firstly, by inputting the same shot within the sequence, Eisenstein demonstrates how there is a willingness for the space to be filled. Much like how Tsar Ivan completes the space by being positioned in its center, he also fulfills and brings together the Russian state. This juxtaposition, as Thompson states, reiterates the fact that he has formed the pivot of the sequence by entering the previously unoccupied central space. Secondly, Tsar Ivan's centrality is further iterated by how the space around him converges to the specific point he occupies. The space around the Tsar not only converges towards him, but it also diverges from him, positing him as a fulcrum that directs the whole structure. This affirmation of Ivan's centrality through these two redundant techniques, spatial composition and editing, indicates the workings of the Soviet regime. It primarily showcases the centrality and superiority that is present within the regime itself. In other words, it is an affirmation on how structures are dictated from one nodal point, from Ivan and Stalin. Similarly, at the end of the film, when Ivan gains the will of the people as they beg him to come back to the throne, the spatial composition once again iterates his centrality in space. Just take a look at this long shot of Ivan standing tall on top of an oblique structure, gazing at the people begging for him to return. Now let's remove Ivan from the frame. Let's focus on the outline of the wall, let's put Ivan back in there. Isn't the resemblance uncanny? The outlines of both Ivan and the wall structure are formed in a similar manner. And then, Eisenstein adds even a third layer of semblance with the curve the people form in the background. So there are thus three layers of planes that extend from Ivan's figure to the walls and the marching people. It is as if the space conforms and maneuvers around his bodily figure. The space is dictated by him. Also, the people are an extension of Ivan's centralized totalitarian power, much like in the Soviet regime itself, as Slavoj Žižek claims in relation to totalitarian regimes. The people exist in a totalitarian reality only as a factor in the legitimization of the leader. Even when he leaves the space, his powerful ghost and its structure still resonate within the layers themselves. Eisenstein dug and excavated the dark underside of the regime. He did so in his film, albeit implicitly. Through these hidden formal and filmic forms, he represented Ivan's psyche through many cinematic channels. By excessively affirming the mechanisms of the Soviet regime, he frustrated the boundaries of what is acceptable to portray and to talk about within the regime. He provided a platform in which repressed feelings towards the regime could be voiced. He brought out what couldn't be articulated within the regime through the film. This is primarily where Eisenstein's ingenuity lies, as he uses the audiovisual medium to not merely subvert nor to affirm the ideology, which leaves the film in an ambivalent and ambiguous space in general. It is within this space where negotiations take place that might eventually transform the hegemonic ideology.